I want to introduce our keynote speaker for the morning, Dr. Ronald Williamson. And before I go through the formal career highlights, I want to recall a story when I first met Dr. Williamson. We were introduced by a common friend, Mr. Stewart from the McLean Foundation, also an archaeologist, and he said to me, "You got to meet this guy, this Ronald Williamson." I said, "Sure." We went for a lunch, and he asked me, "So what's this Greenbelt?" And at that time, the Greenbelt was fairly young. And I go through what the Greenbelt is: a protected area, an important landmark in nature conservation and agricultural conservation in southern Ontario. And it's fairly young, 2 years old. And as I was telling the story, he looked at me and says, "You know what? Your Greenbelt isn't 2 years old. Your Greenbelt is 12,000 years old." And he went through the story, which he's going to tell today, about how Aboriginal communities in this part of the world had their own Greenbelt around their communities because they had to feed up to 2,000 people at a time. And they had to build an agricultural Greenbelt around their communities in order to have the calorie intake that they needed. So he tells a fascinating story about a part of the history of this region that is perhaps often overlooked. And one of the ironies I find in his piece of work is that most of the findings he has, or many of the findings he has in his work as an archaeologist, we are finding because suburbs are being built over important heritage sites from our Aboriginal communities from many thousands of years ago. So there's a certain irony in that building over and paving over these areas gives us a sense of that history. So that's how I met Dr. Williamson, and when we organized this conference, I said, "Look, he's got a great story. It's not a planning story. It's not an environmental story. It's not a farming story. It's a historical story. And we should tell that story not only to our partners here in Ontario and in Canada, but also to our international guests." Dr. Williamson has been an archaeologist for almost 40 years. He has extensive field experience. He has a BA from the University of Western Ontario and an MA and a PhD from McGill University, and all in anthropology. He founded a firm called Archaeological Services in 1980, and he's directed over 1,000 archaeological assessments, excavations, and planning projects in the Great Lakes region. That's right, over 1,000 of them. So this guy knows what he's talking about. And when I met him, he gave me a book to read that he edited and wrote the chapter in, and that is an illustrated history of Toronto's 12,000 years, going back again to the Aboriginal community, all the way to the famous crystal at the ROM, that those of you know it. He's an associate member of the graduate faculty at the University of Toronto, and again, he tells a wonderful story. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Ronald Williamson.
Well, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Burkhard. The first slide I have up tells a little bit of that irony that Burkhard was just referring to. Those are all archaeological sites that range in size from, let's say, 400 square meters through to 10 acres in size. And you can see that about half of them are in the Greenbelt and half of them are in the already developed area. And the true irony is that for me to tell you about this history of South Central Ontario, this area, the history of the Greenbelt, I have to talk about sites that have been excavated to make way for development. So I'm going to just launch into this because I have to cover 12,000 years of history in 30 minutes. First of all, when you meet First Nations people, they will tell you they have always been here, and Western science has absolutely no argument with that, in the sense that as long as it has been possible to occupy Ontario, people have been here. So as soon as the continental glacier had receded, which you see in the gray line here, north of Lake Huron, people were moving into southern Ontario and central Ontario and setting up shop. Now, what did shop look like? Well, of course, those of you who know the environmental history of this area know that it wasn't always the kind of deciduous forest that we have today, but more like a subarctic tundra-like pine forest type thing. And we had folks who were actually hunting caribou and indeed extinct megafauna like mastodon, which you see in the bottom right image. We have just outside of Buffalo a site where mastodon bone has been found with human tools that date to 11,500 years ago, so we know this was happening. They were butchering that bone. And this was happening throughout all of southern Ontario. We don't find much about these sites, so really only their stone tools, the very distinctive tools which you see in the lower left. Very curious story that happened very close to where we're sitting today. That dotted line is where the shoreline of Lake Ontario was at 11,500 years ago, about 20 miles or 20 kilometers further out. And in 1908, some people were doing a tunnel near Hanlon's Point, and the workers found in a gray clay below the surface of the water, they're tunneling, this absolutely clear set of human footprints heading north from Hanlon's Point area. And of course, it utterly confused everybody. They called in the geologist of the day, A.P. Coleman, and he came and said, well, these certainly look like human footprints. There were a number of people who looked at them. They confirmed they could see the ball, the toe images. They were moccasin prints. There were some children and some adults. They're heading towards us from the former shoreline. They put the call out and they invited a number of very distinguished archaeologists of the time to come and have a look at this when the inevitable happened. And I call it the inevitable because it's happened to me many times, where you're in a monitoring situation and the supervisor or the foreman of the excavation says, we don't have time for this. And that's exactly what happened in 1908. People had been invited, but the foreman said, no, we're going ahead, destroyed the footprints. All we have are actually these drawings of the footprints. It's a bad image, you can't see it, but you can see where it happened. If that were found today, it would be the most amazing archaeological find of the century in this area, to find footprints from 11,500 years ago. I believe they were footprints. The Great Clay now, we believe, is actually laid down just after the last glaciation. So an interesting story of what could be. What's most fascinating about that is that the biggest sites are probably inundated. They're under Lake Ontario for that period, 11,500 years ago. Although the Iroquois shoreline, which is the Davenport Ridge here in Toronto, would have been a place from which people would have hunted caribou. Here's where I do about 6,000 years in 15, 20 seconds. The next period is a period where, first of all, the environment changes to one more like we have today. And we have folks who are continuing to hunt and gather, only there's a much richer environment in which to do that. We don't know a lot about who they are, but by about 4,000, 5,000 years ago, we have a sense that they're starting to speak an Algonquian language. There are two main language groups in this part of the Great Lakes, Algonquian and Iroquoian. Iroquoian are the Iroquois from New York State, or the Huron and Peton from here. And Algonquin are all the Ojibwa and the Mississauga folks. So we think by about 5,000 years ago, people were speaking Algonquian. Their settlements are very small. They're always by water. In fact, of the 18,000 archaeological sites that are pre-contact in the Ontario Archaeological Record, 95% of them are within 300 meters of water. It's not rocket science. You need it for drinking water. You need it for cooking. And in the case of big rivers like the Grand River, which was, frankly, the prehistoric equivalent of the 401, that is, your transportation as well. So this would be a typical scene throughout those 4,000 or 5,000 years. One particular site, this is now a housing subdivision, and here's my point. We've got this beautiful Greenland here, and there's this 9,000-year-old site sitting in a field. You can't even really see the water that it was at one time associated with. That's just showing you the size of the site, and that little kind of yellow-red area are the hot spots where we get the most artifacts, and there's really only 30 artifacts per square meter, so it's not like this hugely rich site. But it's so important because it dates to 9,000 years ago. And that little component yielded all of these points, and they're all the same. You can see the little serrated edges on them. They're really not much bigger than about that. They're not arrowheads, they're spear points. But they're a particular style. We know that they date to about 9,000 years ago. And this little area, not bigger than the size of this stage, is where they were hunting, or where they were butchering animals and pulling the spears out of the animals and breaking the, you can see every single one of these has the tip broken off as they're pulling the thing back and starting to rework those stone tools 9,000 years ago. That is in southern Vaughan, is where that was found. And there was another little site that we found the year later in the next field over, because as you all know, development is inevitable. It goes from one field to the next. And here we go, Andridge site. We excavate it. It's exactly the same time period, only a completely different tool set. So although these are very small sites, the size of this stage, they're spread around this field and the adjacent field, and there's little components. And here's one where once the hides had been taken off the caribou, they were actually processing them with these stone tools. So we can actually differentiate the places within these fields where they're doing different activities. There are also other kinds of sites we find dating to this period. One of the ones that captures people's attention is caching. It's where these stone tools that are turned into projectile points are actually buried in the ground. So the bottom right shows you what it looks like with all those tools laid out, but the upper left is what it's like. It was buried in a bag. The bag, this is literally, this particular one is about 1,500 to 1,600 years old. This bag disintegrated, and all we're left with at the basically intersection between the topsoil and the subsoil is this cluster of points. So we come down on it excavating, and we realize we have to excavate very carefully to get the cluster of bifaces, which is what they're called. And it's a behavior that's much like hoarding. Some of these we know were placed in the ground to never be retrieved again. Sometimes they're placed in bogs. And this is very reminiscent of medieval hoarding behavior, where you get caches of shields or swords. And so it's a very interesting behavior that we see throughout this period. But the other thing I wanted to bring out is the fact that there is just some astounding art that was created by people over these thousands of years. Every piece here is probably 3,000 or 4,000 years old. And you're using Huronian banded slate to create, to carve, and then smooth these beautiful objects that may have been weights for spear throwers, or they may simply have been on poles as staff, kind of at the top of staffs. In the upper right, one of the most beautiful artifacts I've ever seen is a kind of black piece of slate, and that's natural geological banding that's in that slate. Somebody's walking along the North Shore and sees that, North Shore of Lake Erie, sees that and can envision it in an arrowhead shape as a pendant, puts it on a copper necklace, and that's how we found it abandoned in a pit. Also, the fact that these groups at this time are not insular in any way. They are, in fact, linked across the continent in order to bring goods across or into the Great Lakes region from the Gulf Coast, from the Midwest, from the north. Silver comes in from the north. You can see in these slides, or in this slide, the fact that material is coming all over the place. So very aware of the resources that are in other areas, and in no way are these groups insular. Well, something happens about 2,000 years ago that changes the way people live in this area, and that is the introduction of maize up the Mississippian Valley, ultimately from Mexico. And we see that there's about a 1,000-year period of learning what to do with corn and turn it into village life, as opposed to settled village life, staying in one place, as opposed to the kind of nomadic life that I painted for that first 6,000 or 7,000 years. We actually think that the people who brought this maize may have been Iroquoian speakers from further south, and hence they introduced the Iroquoian language to this area, such that that dark gray area you see in this slide is the area where you get the evolution of the five-nation Iroquois, of the Huron, the Peton, and the Neutral, that the early Europeans in this area record on, and which so much has been written about in the world literature. So that little area is still surrounded by Algonquian-speaking peoples, the Ojibwa, the Mississauga, but it's that little area that focuses on farming life. And the life is really amazing. They eventually set up these large villages that get to be 10 acres in size. And this particular one that I just showed you is from coalescence. It's from a whole series of smaller villages of 3 or 4 houses. They're coming together to form this big village that ends up being about 9 acres. Well, the curious thing is that at 1500 AD, they all pick up and move to a new one called Mantle, which is just south of Stouffville. And that's what it looks like. It's 10 acres in size. It has 95 houses. There are probably 2 phases of occupation. At any one time, 50 to 55 houses. We now know there's about 1,800 people at this site at one time. It takes 60 to 80,000 trees to build this settlement. This is Stone Age technology. Every person's eating a pound of corn per day per person. Okay, so a pound of corn per day per person. So you need 1,800 pounds of corn per day for this community. Fascinating material culture that tells us a lot about it. There's the late stage. For those of you who aren't familiar with our Ontario Springs, from here, that bottom right shows you a shot of the kind of snow that you experienced yesterday. You can imagine living in a woodland, bark-covered structures and all of that. One of the most amazing things about this particular site is the first evidence of waste stream management. These folks were actually taking the waste from the interior of the village and placing it in that kind of dark stain on the outside of the palisade. So they have 3 rows of palisade. You got 1,800 people living in this 10-acre enclosure, but all of their inorganic and organic refuse, they're streaming outside and into a borrow ditch outside the palisade. Because we've seen in previous generations these middens on the inside of the village, and of course that would create an environment that would force people to want to get out of that environment more quickly than if you're streaming your waste out. So it's a really interesting development at this site. Fine discarded ceramic vessels that you see here. We have local and exotic ceramic types, back to the issue that they're communicating and interacting with folks from further afield. The bottom left is a very interesting kind that we see only on Onondaga and Oneida sites in southern New York or central New York State. So in fact, we're seeing a direct link between a site in Stouffville, just north of Toronto, 20 kilometers north of Toronto, and these sites that would have been in central New York State. So they're interacting for some reason. These humanoid-like figures on these pots are thought to be, and these are the tops of the pots, these are thought to be mythological figures that people had relationships with in order to acquire good corn crops. So they show up on pots likely used for that. Now, one of the things we do, obviously, is we'll do some hard science as well, and we're working with the reactor at McMaster, and the short-lived radioisotopes are telling us that the clay that these particular ceramic pots are made of is not local. It's not the same clay as all the other ones from the site. So it could very well be that that's the clay from central New York State and from the communities there, and they're bringing the pots up one way or the other. Being around 1500, this site actually we think was occupied between 1500 and 1525, 1530. There isn't a lot of evidence of trade. You might think, okay, well, Cartier comes up the St. Lawrence River in 1535, but we know that goods were coming in to this region, to the Great Lakes region, actually before that. If this one object, which is an iron sout found in the bottom of a pit in one of those longhouses, is European, and we think it has the shape of a European ship plane, so it would have been the blade on a plane. It's only about that long. If that's what it is, and it's very hard to tell for sure, although it's a tool type that you don't see in the 19th century, which would be intrusive then, we can test the rust, and we're doing this right now, because when the piece was actually fired, the rust, as it degrades, will reflect the charcoal used in, or the wood used in its firing, and we think we can get a signature on whether that happened in the 16th century or that happened in the 19th century, which would give us an idea of, yes, it's a trade good, or no, it isn't, because it's very hard. You can't date that. in any, it's inorganic. Some fabulous ceramic effigies. These are on pipes. The image would face the smoker, so it's obviously self-directed art. It may be a private ceremony. But the one in the upper left caught our attention. It's very unique. It's the only one of its kind in the Great Lakes region, a ceramic pipe with those use of dots. And the only other object in the Great Lakes is a bone figurine from a Mohawk site in New York State that has the same line of dots. But we think very much that this is a reference to tattooing, because identity at this time was very much communicated through what you wear, through your hairstyle, through personal adornment, and obviously through your tattoos. And here are a couple of images of what people think, using the ethnographic descriptions of what Huron looked like 100 years later. Here's an idea of what people look like. The Peitun actually were described. These are the people that lived around Collingwood. These are the people that were described by the first Europeans as having tattoos and covering every square inch of their body. So we know that personal adornment, you could obviously tell what nation somebody was from based on that kind of decoration. Yes, we find all sorts of corn, and I get a real charge out of folks when I hear people talk about the little gardens that are around these Iroquoian villages. These villages did not have little gardens of corn. If you're going to feed people a pound of corn per day and you need 1,800 pounds of corn per day, you have massive corn systems, massive field systems. That's the maize. It's about a 6-inch cob, 8 rows. The kernel looks pretty much the same as today. But there's the 10-year field for this site, which covers most of Stouffville. I was in Stouffville a couple of weeks ago actually giving a lecture about this site. And they were just absolutely astonished to find that the hall in which we were speaking was in the cornfield of the Mantle site. That's at 10 years, and these sites were known to go probably about 15 to 20 years, and that would have meant really 5 kilometers of corn around the village. Now, there were several towns at any one time, and we're talking about 400 years of Iroquoian village life with these kinds of corn systems, or field systems. I can tell you that from the Credit River to the Rouge River, from the current Lake Ontario to Lake Simcoe, would not have been forest between 1200 AD and 1600 AD. It would be a series of fields in production and secondary growth forest, because the whole North Shore had been farmed already. And that's why one of my mentors actually was a guy named Bruce Trigger out of McGill University, and Bruce, his first book was called Huron Farmers of the North. They had pretty much cleared the entire North Shore of Lake Ontario. The other main problem these folks faced was clothing themselves. They needed basically 2 deer skins per year to clothe themselves. You can imagine the competition that might have evolved between neighboring villages to get all the deer. And what it meant was they had to grow enough corn not only for themselves, but to trade with Algonquian neighbors so that they could get moose skins to help clothe themselves as well. Because if you just look at the fact, we looked at 37,000 pieces of animal bone off of that Mantle site. We looked and identified every one we could to species. We have a full range of all the fish. We're actually involved with DNA studies of lake trout, trying to figure out what species were here early. This is one of the real values of archaeological and archaeofauna studies, is that we know what was here 500 or 600 years ago or beyond. And in this particular site, they're obviously focusing on mammalia and on deer. But, you know, when we look at, there's 2 villages being modeled here, one called Mantle, another one called Seed Barker on the Humber River. And their territories for hunting deer overlap significantly. And we actually think that that was one of the contributors to feuding that we know happened between these communities. We actually find human crania on these sites that are isolated, meaning, you know, beheadings, etc. And what it shows us is that feuding, like anywhere in the world, was happening around competition for resources. Wherever 2,000 people have lived, 2,000 people have died, and all of this area shows massive cemeteries as well. And the Huron, who I've been focusing on, it was ancestral Huron who lived in the Mantle site. They had a particular ceremony where everybody who had died over the course of the village was buried into a common pit, which is being depicted in the bottom right, or in the famous Lafiteau painting on the left. We found one of these in the late 90s in North York, now Toronto, near Leslie and the 401, in a soccer field. How did we find it? We found it when the fence post, I'm trying to advance this here, here we are, where the fence post pierced this ossuary. Now, a lot of the time people wonder, why is it First Nations get so concerned about their burials being disturbed? It's not rocket science to figure that out. But here's the kicker. First Nations, especially the Huron and Iroquois, believed that every individual had two souls. So when you disturb the bones, you're not just disturbing souls. It's not a Christian ideology. There's one soul that's still with those bones. One soul goes to the sky world at death. And these souls that are with these bones have to be assuaged. They have to be told that they won't be disturbed again. And actually the First Nation asked that this, because of this disturbance, that this be picked up and moved and placed somewhere where it would never be disturbed again in exactly the same way, which gave us an opportunity to dig this very carefully to understand how they were put together. Well, following this period, we also get the Europeans arriving and mapping onto local societies European global politics. We see the French and the English carrying on, the English and Dutch supporting the New York Iroquois and the French supporting the Huron. And we get battles starting to happen. This is Champlain and two of his cronies working with the Huron attacking an Onondaga village. A curious image, you see the palm trees in the background, wouldn't have been there. And these are not native canoes, these are French bateaux, would have been comfortable in the Seine. It's because this was done in the 1670s by someone who's actually trying to illustrate a description out of Champlain. And then when the Europeans in 1600 to 1651, this is where people were. You have Huron between Lake Simcoe and Georgian Bay, the neutral around the west end of Lake Ontario, and the Iroquois and the Iroquois Lake, but still surrounded by people who were Algonquian speakers, the Ojibwa, the Mississauga, etc. Well, then what happens is the New York Iroquois come up because of this global warfare and the fur trade warfare, and they push the Huron and neutral and all the Ontario Iroquois out. They take over villages along the North Shore. Within 50 years, the Mississauga descend down, and they push the Iroquois. The French are attacking Iroquois villages in New York State, so they're pushing the Iroquois back, and we get those villages occupied by Mississauga people. I'm painting a picture here that this history is very complex and changes constantly. It's very dynamic. And in fact, we get the earliest French maps showing us those villages, but they also show us trails leading up to Lake Simcoe. And one of those trails is the West Trail on the Humber, but the East Trail on the Rouge River. And some of the attempts by communities like Markham to create green corridors on those major systems are in fact linked to this history in very real ways, because here's those green corridors, and here's all the archaeological sites clustered along those corridors. The point I'm making is those trails, as documented in 1680, were used and had been used for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And the patterns that we're seeing, and any effort we make to preserve those green corridors, we're also making the effort, without even knowing it, to preserve the archaeological record of the use of those corridors for thousands of years. So here's the sites in the Greenbelt, with the ones that have been developed taken out. Now, that doesn't mean that all of these are intact. Some of these were excavated for research purposes, but the point I want to make is how rich the archaeological record is in the Greenbelt, and we have a responsibility to manage them and to interpret them. We've been a leader, actually Ontario, in the world in what are called management plans, where we take archaeological sites, we identify where they are, we predict where additional ones will be, and we create policies on how to protect them, how to interpret them, and how to manage them. In fact, the Ipperwash report, which was a policy piece that followed on the death of a native person at Ipperwash in the mid-1990s, one of the recommendations was that every municipality should have an archaeological management plan. Trying to get the next slide again. And that's Toronto's. Toronto's management plan has been in the works for a long time. So in planning in Toronto, you would, anytime any plan comes into the city that touches any pink, it gets an archaeological assessment. If it touches the red, even a building permit calls for an archaeological assessment, because that red are known rich archaeological sites. So what would the objectives be in an AMP for a Greenbelt area? It would be exactly the same. We want to get a reliable inventory of what's there. We want to predict where there would be additional sites. We want to manage them, because even farming practice disturbs archaeological sites. Sometimes leaving them completely alone leads through erosion and other natural processes to their degradation. So managing these archaeological resources is a very important thing if we want to use them in the long term for protection. Our biggest issue really is protection of these resources, because even when roads are being put in through greenbelts, ossuaries, for example, are found. Not that long ago, just north of the city at Jane and Teston Road, an ossuary was found during a road widening. And this road widening, it was actually a Six Nations band member who was on the machine, cut into the side of an ossuary. He thought it was a wood deposit until he saw a skull roll down, and then he shut down the site. And it took us the better part of 4 months to put the site back together, but York Region moved the road and became, at that time, the First Nation communities were very grateful and looked to York Region for leadership now because of that. So what we've done in Vaughan, in their archaeological management plan, is actually look at the villages and the 1 kilometer radius around those villages as highest potential areas for ossuaries. And what kind of policies can we put in place for road construction and engineering so that we don't keep hitting them? Because every time we find one of these, we're finding them through construction/destruction. How can we either find them at the moment of impact or figure out where they might be through survey, which is a tough job. The other thing we did there is we created a sacred cultural heritage landscape, I think the first of its kind in the Great Lakes region, where we identified a village site called Scantatat and its ossuary on the other side of the Humber River called Kleinberg Ossuary. There's a huge amount of land owned by the Ontario government through the Ontario Heritage Trust, and we, working with Vaughan, looked at the opportunities for linking these two in the same way that we have in Europe, where you have large landscapes that are protected. You have a site, let's say Stonehenge. If you stand on Stonehenge, which is a spectacular site, but as you look around you, you see all these burial mounds, and all of this is linked in a landscape plan. We need to do the same thing here, because as I was showing you, a village, it's not just the village, it's the 5 kilometers around the village, and they're linked throughout the entire continent. So how can we conceive of ways of interpreting the landscape from 500-600 years ago, or indeed from those other sites I showed you 9,000 or 10,000 years ago? How can we conceive of a landscape plan that links the cultural heritage to the natural heritage? And in fact, one of the things I want to say is just point to the fact that cultural heritage is inextricably linked with natural heritage. In fact, it's one of the core values of our company. And I find it, and I very much here am borrowing from David Donnelly, who at the Ipperwash Commission asked why it is that a wetland gets automatic protection and a place where 2,000 people lived for 30 years and left all their remains and their dead and the souls of their dead isn't protected. How's that possible? We need to understand the links between natural and cultural heritage, and we need better planning mechanisms to protect those places. We need to consult with the descendants of these communities, which I might add we do regularly now, the archaeological community. And I think, like the Nature Conservancy of Canada, we need an Archaeological Heritage Conservancy of Canada, where there are funds that people can turn to in emergency situations to bring those sites into public ownership. And I think that happens more frequently in land which is scheduled for development, but I happen to know it happens in land in Greenbelt situations as well, where there are unintended consequences for sites that are in the way of infrastructure. So I think we all need to try and address the issue of cultural heritage protection and management as we move forward in the very good works that all you people are doing to protect the natural environment. Thanks.